Good evening, everyone. My name is John Taves, and I'm the event coordinator here at McNally Robinson Booksellers. Before we begin, we'd like to acknowledge that we are here in Treaty 1 territory, and that the land on which we gather is the traditional territory of Anishinaabe, Aninawak, Anishinaabe, Dakota, and Dene peoples, the homeland of the Métis Nation. In addition, most importantly, of course, McNally Robinson itself rests on the land once occupied by the Métis community of Roostertown. We are gathered here tonight to celebrate the launch of Cheryl Parisien's debut novel, The Unweaving. Most importantly, right off the top, I do need to emphasize that because it is a debut novel, you need to be even more raucous than you typically would be at every point. It is a legal obligation. We're delighted that Tidewater Press not only published this book, but arranged for this evening to take place. And I won't take too much of your time, but I will just quickly go over how the evening will play out. There'll be a reading from Cheryl up at the top here for Behind the Podium, and then we'll move along to a conversation at the chairs to my left, hosted by Dave Williamson. Following that, if time permits, there'll be an opportunity for you gathered here to ask questions. So if a question does occur to you, please just put up your hand and I will approach you with this microphone in a non-threatening manner to ensure that anyone watching live can hear the question and just allows Cheryl to go on and answer. I'll be back at the end to go over signing procedure, but for now, I have the great pleasure of introducing both of tonight's participants. Your host, Dave Williamson, has written several novels, a collection of short stories, a memoir, drama for television and stage, and over 1,000 book reviews. Founder of the Creative Communications Program at Red River College, he was Dean of Business and Applied Arts there for over 20 years, retiring in 2006. His most recent novel, Visiting Fellow, was published by Turnstone Press. Our guest of honor this evening, Cheryl Parisien, is a Red River Métis writer who lives here in Winnipeg, Manitoba, Treaty 1 territory. Her ancestors lived on the river lots of St. Norbert, and her roots stretch back to the beginning of the Métis homeland. Loosely based on her family's history, The Unweaving is her first novel. Please give an incredibly warm welcome to her.
Bonsoir, Tanishikiawa. Thank you everyone for coming. It's truly an honor to be here, and I'm so touched to see so many friendly and familiar faces here. It's a real honor, thank you. So my name is Cheryl Parisien. I'm Red River Métis. My ancestors lived on the river lots in St. Norbert. Both of my parents are from a small town called Sandylands in southeastern Manitoba. And some of my family names include Tourond, Rougeau, Delorme. So I'm going to do a reading from early in the book. This is when we first meet Charlotte, who's the eldest daughter of the Rougeau family. She's 16 and is already a master at beadwork. She yearns for something more than the life she's known and feels hard done by and enraged at her circumstances like only a teenage girl can. Charlotte, July 1869. Charlotte stabbed her finger with her sewing needle. She was practicing her embroidery, adding pink flowers to the edge of a handkerchief. "Ah ben," she hissed and sucked up the blood that bubbled from her fingertip. Suzette snickered. Charlotte glared at her as she examined her finger. Her left thumb and index finger were calloused and rough. She could see all the points where the needle had poked her skin and healed over, a testament to her many years of sewing. Imperfections. She'd started sewing as soon as she was old enough to thread a needle. Her mother had been eager to put her to work. Charlotte wondered how many times her fingers had been poked. Too many times to count, probably. Her mother never showed any sympathy, said she should use a thimble if she wanted to keep her fingers pristine. But Charlotte could never get the feel of it right. The thimble was in the way. and her thumb was unprotected anyway, so why bother? Instead, she just learned to live with having rough fingers. It wasn't as though the rest of her hands looked any better. Her skin was often dry and cracked because of all the washing, gardening, hauling, chopping, drudgery. She set the needle down and looked out the window, where an orange square of evening light from the setting sun filled the glass. Every day was the same, a circle, a loop of thread that pulled tighter and tighter, binding her to this life. In the mornings, she helped prepare their breakfast, then cleaned it all up after. Then it was the washing, or drawing water from the well, or tending the garden, gathering eggs, milking the cow, feeding the pig, sweeping the floor. Then more meals, more cleaning up after the meals, then finally some sewing by lamplight. No time left to wander the meadow, soak her feet in the soggy mud by the riverbed, lie in the grass and watch the clouds change shape in the sky. Only work, always more work. Even the work that she liked, such as embroidery and beading, had the joy stripped from it because of all the other endless chores pressed so heavily upon her. She looked over at her grandmother, Mère, sewing in the same circle of lamplight as her and Suzette. Mère was Sauteau and had been born in the northern forests, somewhere near York Factory. Mère's family had died when she was young, and she had been taken in by some people from the fort at York Factory. She married a voyageur and ended up in Red River when she was 16, the same age Charlotte was now. Everyone called her Mère because when Julien was learning to talk, he could never quite say ma mère, and so Mère had stuck. Mère had lived with them for Charlotte's whole life. Her grandfather had died before she was born. When Charlotte was 4 or 5, Mère told her the story of what had happened to him. He dropped dead that winter when he was hanging bells and ribbons on the dog carryalls. We were getting ready to go to a dance, and Père was setting us up to arrive in style. Instead, when I went outside to leave, I found him in the snow, his eyes frozen open and lifeless, ribbons dripped in his hand, waving in the wind. Mère had told this story matter-of-factly, and that made it terrifying. For weeks afterwards, she dreamed of those unseeing eyes and waving ribbons. Even now, the sound of tinkling bells and whipping ribbons on winter nights brought the dreams back. Mère was absorbed in her work, her face close to the pad saddle she was working on. Her straight black hair was parted in the middle and pulled tight in the back. Only a few gray hairs streaked the front, evenly spaced from the part. She kept her thumbnails long to sweep the beads into place as she sewed, and to pull out stitches with the sharp corner of her nail when she needed to. The rest she kept trimmed short. Charlotte watched her wrinkled brown hands move in a smooth rhythm. Stitch, bead, stitch, bead, stitch, bead. Her chest rose and fell in time with her movements, calm, steady. Sometimes Charlotte thought she heard a quiet drumbeat when she watched her grandmother work. Suzette got up from her chair to show her rosettes to Mère, her face hopeful, expectant. How eager Suzette was to get even the smallest crumb of praise. Suzette was still learning, but her progress was slow. She was an adequate beater, even if her rows were jagged, each bead slightly off, not perfectly aligned and spaced like Charlotte's. Her embroidery was worse, the weight of her stitches either too heavy or too light. Charlotte had shown Suzette how to do it over and over, and Suzette never got better. Suzette held her hoop of fabric in front of Mère, her eyes downcast, waiting for Mère to inspect her work only when she was ready. Sometimes she looked up right away, and sometimes Suzette stood with her arm held out for several minutes. Today she didn't make Suzette wait. She snatched the hoop and looked at it closely. Then she handed it back without looking at Suzette. "The thread needs to sing to you," Mère said. "This has no music in it." Suzette hung her head and went back to her chair. Charlotte asked to see Suzette's hoop. "Do you want me to draw the stitch marks for you to make it easier?" she asked. "I can do it," Suzette snatched the hoop back. "You just need to practice, that's all. It isn't hard. Maybe for you." "Enough, you two," Mère said. "You both have different strengths. Look how good Suzette's braided mats are. The weave is so tight you could turn them into bowls and carry water with them." Suzette beamed, and Charlotte gave her a half smile. The last year or so, nearly everything Suzette did irritated her. Suzette had grown nearly as tall as Charlotte, even though she was only 12. Her limbs seemed too long for her body, and she'd become easily distracted and testy. Charlotte refused to put up with it. She put the embroidery away and picked up her beadwork. She was working on a new project, something she was excited about, a decorative shelf valance made of velvet. She'd gotten the idea from the wall pockets she usually made. The wall pockets were pouches of various size and shape, made from deer hide or any scrap fabric, and elaborately embroidered. Charlotte had made ones for her mother, Mare, and Suzette last year. They hung on the wall by their usual chairs in the sitting room and held their sewing supplies. The pouches were pretty to look at while also being useful. Charlotte wanted to make something that was decorative only, something she could enjoy looking at for its own sake, that was simply beautiful. Decor, it was called. She liked the sound of it. Not everything had to be useful, to have a purpose. Her aunt Denise had given her a scrap of black velvet that she'd hemmed into a scalloped edge, then visualized her bead pattern. Triple vines entwined together with red, pink, and white flowers interspersed among the leaves. The colors stood out against the black velvet. She was only partway done on the beading, but already she could tell it was her best work yet. She thought about this project as she scrubbed clothes in the wash bin and chopped vegetables for dinner. She usually rushed through these rote tasks so they would be over sooner. Lately, she'd stretch them out, letting her mind come up with new design ideas as she worked. Inspiration came from whatever was in front of her. Carrot slices became orange flower centers or setting suns. At night, she'd lie in bed and look at the patch of sky she could see through the small window. Soon the idea of a star pattern with different phases of the moon took hold. She wanted to bring the night sky inside so she could look at it always. It calmed her thoughts. She hadn't told anyone about her star pattern idea yet. She could already hear her mother saying it was foolish. Mare would say nothing as usual, only stare at her long and hard until Charlotte reached the right conclusion and scrapped the idea. She decided to keep it to herself. Once this shelf valance was done, she'd see how it went. Maybe it would turn into something, maybe it wouldn't. And besides, having a secret idea was exciting in its own way. It was something she had just for herself. The room was quiet except for the sound of rustling fabric as Suzette ripped out her stitches. Sometimes Mare could be a bit too harsh. Charlotte watched Suzette's small but violent stabbing at her veiled rosettes. She could see Suzette hardening inside. Mare's criticisms were usually right, but she could be blunt to the point of cruelty at times. Charlotte wondered if that was on purpose. Mare had layers to her. She could laugh at anything and seemed to enjoy watching the boys pull pranks on each other. But she could also fall into quiet periods when her thoughts seemed to be far away, as if she was in another realm or perhaps lost in the past. Sometimes a story about Mare's childhood would come out mixed with instructions on how to do something, like how she told Charlotte about how much she missed the northern rivers when teaching her to properly dry fish. She tried to ask Mare for more stories directly. She was hungry for them. But Mare was good at evasion. The stories only came in sideways, and Charlotte collected them like treasures. Mare was a puzzle to be solved. Mare cut some thread with her ulu knife. It had a curved, semicircle-shaped blade with a wooden handle. It looked like a knife that would be better for scraping hides, but Mare used it for everything. She carried it in a leather pouch that she kept in her pocket at all times. She'd had it since she was a young girl. It had belonged to her mother. Mare said it was a sacred object, a woman's tool that was handed down from mother to daughter. If the knife were lost or broken, it was a bad omen. It needed to be cared for with reverence and protected always. Charlotte could not understand why Mare preferred to use the knife when sewing scissors seemed so much simpler to use. They offered better control. Scissors make you lazy, she said, yet she never chided the girls for using them. When Charlotte was around 10 years old, she tried using the ulu knife to cut thread, but she missed the thread and sliced her thumb open instead. She cried and ran to her mother for help as angry red blood rushed from the wound. Mare had come to see what the commotion was and given her a knowing look. You tried using the ulu knife, eh? Charlotte had nodded and tried to suck the tears back up into her eyes. She didn't want to look like a baby in front of Mare. The knife knew it was being used by the wrong hands and bit back. You can only use it when you're ready. Charlotte rubbed the scar. Since that day, she'd avoided the knife as though it were alive, something that plotted. Mare always made sure it was the sharpest knife in the house.
Well, thank you, Cheryl. That gives everybody an idea of what kind of writing is in this novel. And that you may have heard already that it goes back into the 19th century, but you wouldn't know it because it got rid of all the things that ruin today, like no cell phones and stuff like that. Anyway, but you get a little idea of what the book is about through Charlotte. And I'm gonna just begin by asking Cheryl to tell us what exactly this novel is about.
It's the story of the Riel resistance told through the lens of one family who is sort of a stand-in for my own ancestors who lived on those river lots in St. Norbert. And I wanted to tell the story from the point of view of regular people. If you want to read about that time, I mean, there are tons of books about the Riel resistance, about Riel himself. But I was always wondering, like, what did it feel like? Like, what was it like if you were just a regular person living at that time? So that's sort of it. That's sort of what the book is about, and that's why I chose to tell it that way.
Yeah. Now you also picked a sort of a tough time, and so you'd have built-in conflict.
Yes, of course.
And what exactly was that conflict?
I mean, really, it's the birth of Manitoba, right? I mean, it's a time of great change, and yeah, it's just, I wanted to tell that story from the point of view of regular people.
Right. And you also have the English people moving to Manitoba.
Right, yeah, like, so the area that we're in now, there's known as Manitoba, Red River, was sort of controlled by the HBC. And then they decided to kind of basically sell it to Canada. And so that Canada can move west. And so you've got people from Ontario and more immigrants, primarily English-speaking immigrants, coming here to settle. And then, but you've already got this thriving community here.
Right.
And so what happens when those two things collide?
And another aspect that's another built-in conflict is that the Métis people, Métis kids, were not taught English, right?
Yeah, like there would have been a mix of languages spoken at the time, and you know, people would have had snatches of different languages: French, Michif, English, maybe some Cree, maybe a little bit of Gaelic thrown in there, and you might even hear all of them all in one sentence as people were talking. So it was a real mix of cultures at the time. Yeah, it was just kind of like now, it's multicultural now, but it was a very much a blended society.
Yeah. Yeah, you chose to write it, and we saw an example of a single character point of view, but it's broken up with 4 characters' points of view. A chapter, whenever, for instance, Claudette, not Claudette, Charlotte. Oh, I'm gonna call her Claudette. Whenever Charlotte, as we saw in that particular chapter, that was from Charlotte's point of view.
Right.
And there's something in writing we call the anonymous narration, single character point of view. In other words, we don't know who's telling the story. It's not I, And the nice thing about that kind of writing is, as you know, if the character says, "I'm beautiful," you say, "You are not you." But if an anonymous narrator says, "She is beautiful," you believe it. And so that's the difference, and I think that's one of the factors in what Cheryl chose. But tell us a little bit about why that was important to you.
That style of writing is what feels most natural to me. Doing that sort of close third person, that's just how I write. It's just what comes naturally to me. I find it hard to, within a single chapter, to jump into the heads of different characters who are all in the scene at the same time. I can read books like that, but I don't think I can write them like that. It just doesn't, it feels natural, and I would always end up tripping up. So I focus on one person at a time. And then when I included basically these 4 characters, all those different points of view, that's my way of sort of giving it that sort of broader third person context, so that you can hear and what other people are thinking at the same time, because they don't all agree. They all have different experiences.
Yeah.
So telling it from multiple different points of view was how I did it and what made the most sense to me.
Yeah. What does unweaving mean?
Well, I mean, as you can see, there's like the ceinture fléchée is on there, which is a very Métis symbol. It was a usable, practical garment. It was, used by voyageurs, of course. It's become a symbol of Métis people. And the time that where we begin, you've got a cohesive, thriving community, and they're tightly knit. They're woven together nicely. And then when all of these things happen that kind of fracture that community, that's when they become unwoven. So the society becomes unwoven, but then within each person, there's a little bit of unweaving happening.
Yeah, so everything's being unwoven.
Yeah, but it can be rewoven.
Right. The key element of the novel, if you haven't got it yet, is the fact that it's told from the point of view of 4 different people who are all members of the same family, the Rougeau family. And that's really the secret to how well written this book is, and how interesting it is that you have these 4 people all conducting their lives in lives that are quite interesting, but still all that's going on with the problems happening all around them. So let's take, for instance, Clément, who is the father. Tell us what he does.
Well, he's a carter, a freighter. So it's one of the occupations of a lot of people at the time, was like either transporting furs or whatever sort of goods. Usually, well, often it was on behalf of like the company or other private businesses too. And then often they would go to St. Paul in the United States, and that was a bigger trading area because the train went there, steamships could come from there. So a lot of goods got traded back and forth. And then sometimes they would trade goods like without the company's knowledge or consent. So it was just moving back and forth, which makes sense because movement was sort of life, a way of life. You followed the buffalo herds, or you went to different regions wherever the good medicines were growing, where the hunting was or the trapping was or whatever. So moving back and forth, moving around in a cyclical way is a signature of life. And then, so moving back and forth, south for trading just feels like a natural extension of that.
Yeah, I think that's one of the things that interested me, was that I never thought of and never really knew that there was a trade going back and forth. You mentioned St. Paul as the place they went to, as opposed to Minneapolis. And the Twin City, but St. Paul was more or less first, I guess. And but the fact that there were people in this area who were dealing with St. Paul, and this was their livelihood. So that was an interesting factor, again, separate from the conflict. that's going on around them. So then there's Marienne, the mother. And she's not involved with that so much. What's her?
Well, I mean, she's a strong woman.
Yeah,
And she's very focused on keeping that family together and keeping everybody safe and thriving. And when all this change is coming, her focus is on all of them, keeping them together. She's less concerned with the wider world. So that's sort of what drives her, and that's what keeps her going. She cares about the people. She doesn't really care about who's in charge or who's going to be governor or any of that kind of stuff. Like, she cares about the immediate people and how it affects them and what she can do to keep them all together and safe.
then there's the son. He is the eldest in the family, Rougeau family, the eldest child. And Julien is quite active. And we get to see what the male side of young people was actually involved with.
Mhm.
So what did he do?
Yeah, so he's the eldest son. He's 18 when we first meet him in the book. He's like right on that cusp of manhood. He's young and like full of energy and full of big dreams for what he's going to do with his life. And then when all this conflict starts happening and things start to change rapidly, he wants to be, yeah, he wants to be in there right away. Like, he likes to race horses. He can out jig anybody. Like, he's good at everything he does, and he's sort of like a sunshiny kind of guy. Yeah, when everything starts happening, he has to kind of grow up kind of fast. And he starts to see, like, oh, this is real life. Like, this is real stuff happening, and you see some terrible things as things progress throughout the story. So he's right there in the action. He wants to be part of it, but it does have a cost.
Yeah, and interesting that the father, who is really mostly preoccupied with making a living, the father likes the status quo.
Yes.
And the father doesn't want the boy to get too involved.
Yes.
But he does anyway.
Yeah, exactly. So you've got that sort of father-son conflict happening, and the father's very much like, well, let's just keep things the way they are. Like, let's just get things back to normal.
Right.
Like, when can I get back on that cart trail again? When can we start doing this? And yeah, he has conflict with Julien, because Julien is much more like, I want to be with these new heroes. I want to be with what's happening here. And he's like not interested in his father's little life anymore. So yeah.
And you've already heard a little bit about Charlotte and what she does. And she has a younger sister, Suzette.
Mm-hmm.
And she even admits that Suzette is better at weaving.
Yeah, the braided ropes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so that it's interesting that, again, even though Charlotte is a lovely young woman, she doesn't have the world by the tail, or whatever you want to call it. She feels that Suzette is better at some things than she is. She is concerned about herself, but she's going to find a way. So we get those 4 different people's points of view, and it makes a nice, well-rounded book. Even though you got this conflict going on, and they are affected by it, but they still have their own lives. They still are looking ahead. Yeah, you pretty well talked about Julien's prospects and what he's getting into. The novel was particularly good at showing what women, and we've already touched on it, what women actually did. Because we don't have that many books where they'll tell you that women actually were quite well-rounded individuals. We just get an idea that the women are looking after the kitchen or something.
Mm-hmm.
But these But all four of these characters, we see their point of view. And so when one is at center stage in the novel, we're mainly thinking about him or her, and then we end that and go on to the next one. Meanwhile, all four stories are going on, and they take you ahead. So so as I say, one of the key things is seeing exactly what women did, all the things that women did in those days. HBC has sold us out to Canada. What's the meaning of that?
Well, that's just exactly it. That's like Rupert's Land, right?
Yeah.
Being
Right.
basically sold to Canada so that Canada can expand west without
That's Hudson Bay Company, by
Hudson
the
Bay
way.
Company, and without consulting anybody who was actually living here. And like, you know, that's why you have this conflict and that's why you have this resistance, because it's like, well, wait a minute, like no one asked us and you can't just take our homes away, like, you know,
Yeah.
so that's sort of the beginning of everything.
Right. There's one choice that a writer makes when you're writing a novel, which is supposed to be fiction. And so when you go back to 1869, 70, 71, 72, and you're writing about the time, and you're very much writing about the conflict and the details and the political stuff that's going on, you have a choice as the writer. Who are you going to use of the real people? And are you going to give them a different name? And many writers have done that. In this novel, the guy that we expect to see, and we do see, is Louis Riel. And Louis Riel, and so the choice that Cheryl has to make is, am I going to call him Louis Riel? Why not? Especially right now when he's back in the news, really, in a lot of ways. So how did you feel about naming or saying that the real people? Because besides Riel, tell us who else is there that's real.
There's a few. I mean, I really felt like you couldn't tell this story without including some real life people. I think it would have fallen flat and maybe felt disingenuous if I gave the name of the character of Louis Riel somebody else. I just didn't think that would be right. And I thought that would be like dishonoring to him in a way too. So no, I had to include him for sure, but he's not the focus of the story. He's there because he's such a significant person. All the events are because of him, but he's not the focus of the story. There are lots of books written about him, right? So if you want to learn about his life, you can read many books. That's why I wanted to tell the story from the point of view of like regular people, because that's always where my interest lies. And so some other real people, like I amalgamated some other characters, like there are some people like Ambrose Lepine and Gabriel Dumont. I sort of combined them into another character just because it was going to have too cumbersome to have too many people. Yeah, so some of the names of governors or like, you know, the priests or like those names were the real people. They're in the book, but they're not the focus of the book. And again, I tried to keep it as real as possible. I had to line up real life events. I had to make it fit with the story I was telling. So I did compress time a little bit just because the story, it just made sense with the story. So like for example, the script system really kind of got going more in like 1876-ish and on, but I have it really kicking in sort of 72, 73. I did that on purpose just to make the story fit better. So yeah, there's quite a few real people who were in it, and then some are just amalgams.
One that everybody's probably heard of is Thomas Scott. And really, if you're going to talk about Scott, you always end up talking about Riel, or vice versa. Right. Because one affects the other quite a bit.
Yes. Yeah, he was sort of a rebel rouser, part of the Canadian Party. not known for being a calm, reserved type of person, you know? And so he gets arrested with a group of people, and then he's kept in the fort. And he's nasty, he's difficult to deal with in the prison. And then eventually the decision is made by, well, I think Riel's cabinet, and there was like a actual like a process, like legal process to make it happen, but they decide to execute Thomas Scott. And when they do that, all the like orange men and all the people in Ontario, they seize upon that as a reason to like, we're getting rid of Riel. Like they wanted a reason to get rid of him, and they sort of seized on that, and he becomes like this symbol of sort of like the Canadian Party and the Orange faction. But the counterpoint to that is that there's a real life person who I discovered is my great uncle named Norbert Parisien. And he was not really involved in the resistance at all, but he gets caught up in it. And some of those orange men, including Thomas Scott, capture him and basically kind of lynch him. He's murdered in a horrible way. And I mean, that's a real thing that happened, and it's awful.
Yeah.
And you can read lots of books about Thomas Scott. There's whole books dedicated to him. But like, if you read some of those books, like you might get one sentence about Norbert Parisien, or maybe a paragraph. And I thought, that's a real person, and what happened to him is awful. And it's sort of erased, like it wasn't there. Like, you know, there's like Thomas Scott, but like, what about him? Like, there should be some scales happening here. So, and then I realized like I related to that person, like that's a real life person. And I wanted to honor him in some way. Like I knew I had to put him in there. Like I couldn't just continue with that erasure. Like, no, he has to be in here. And I wanted to honor him in some way.
Yeah, I think one really interesting thing you mentioned about all that, and Julien gets mixed up in this, is when the troops are coming from the east.
Yes.
And it's an army, but along with trained soldiers come these orange men, and also just volunteers, just guys that want to fool around and kill a few people. And so that was how does Julien get involved with that?
Well, because again, he's such a young, fiery guy. As soon as stuff starts happening, like when surveyors start showing up in Red River and they start doing patrols and they start realizing like, hey, something's going down here, he's in there right away. And he's a fan of Louis Riel. I mean, Louis Riel's a charming, you know, such an interesting speaker, it's such charisma. So of course Julien is drawn to that, and he wants to be where the action is. So he finds a way to worm his way in there so he can be there. And yeah, so he's visible, he's there, he sees what happened when Thomas Scott is executed. He's there when like the Wolseley expedition shows up and they're gonna basically execute Riel right then and there. Like he's sort of there right when all that happens. And I mean, that Wolseley expedition was a real thing. I mean, and then once they showed up, things got really ugly, really fast. And then the time after that was basically known as the Reign of Terror, which again, a real life thing that happened, not something you read about a lot in a lot of those books. Like you can read about all of those things, but try to find a book written on the Reign of Terror. Like there aren't a lot. You might get one, again, maybe a chapter, maybe a paragraph. I didn't learn any of this stuff until I was an adult. So I had to figure it all out on my own. It was not taught in school, it was nothing. So I had to include all that stuff. I had to tell the story.
Really interesting that they allowed untrained volunteers.
Yes, yeah, there were actual real soldiers.
Yeah.
And then all these mercenaries.
And then there's the untrained guys.
Yeah, they're the ones who stayed behind. After Wolseley's left, like the soldiers left, those ones stayed behind, and they're the ones who basically caused the Reign of Terror. Like,
right, and they're the ones that ended up killing people.
Yeah, it was bad.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And it was right around that time that Manitoba was created. Do you have the?
Oh yeah, I printed out a little map.
Yeah, I just want you to see what Manitoba looked like.
So after all this stuff goes down and Manitoba becomes a province, you get the first Manitoba is like this little tiny little rectangle down there. So all this over that tiny little piece.
Yeah, so that's where the book takes place. And when we're reading about Manitoba, we're not talking about that great big space, but just a little rectangle. Then another really nice thing about the book is that you're reading all that and lots of bloodshed, and you're not happy about the way the English Canadians treated the Métis, etc. But then we have a chapter with Charlotte, and Charlotte goes to see this woman, Mrs. Wakefield, who is the mother of a guy that Charlotte's interested in. And Mrs. Wakefield, just her character is so good, such a nice contrast between her and the Rougeau family. So we get Mrs. Wakefield coming into it, and it's a great little scene with the two of them. And Mrs. Wakefield wants to learn French. And so she thinks Charlotte can teach her French, which is nice for Charlotte because she has a chance to come and possibly see Clément, who's the guy that she's interested in. A little bit about that.
Sure, yeah, the Wakefield is like sort of like a newcomer family from Ontario. They're wealthy, they're there to make their fortune in Red River because they can see which way the wind is blowing and they're gonna, they decide that this is the place where they're gonna make it for themselves. And there's an elder son, and he's very handsome, and Charlotte sees him and she's, enraptured right away. And he sort of represents all the things that she's not and all the things that she thinks she wants. Like as a teenage girl, Charlotte thinks that she wants, a rich life or a comfortable life or fancy things and lace curtains and all these kinds of things that she doesn't have in her own life. So he's sort of a symbol of that, and that whole family is a symbol of that. And then they become sort of mixed up in the people who, during this reign of terror, after all this awfulness that's happening, these people get pretty rich off the backs of the Métis people. And so, so there's that conflict there. Charlotte does get involved with that family. She helps teach them. There's a daughter that she teaches French to, and she's sort of like a friend for them, like a companion for them. But then once things start changing in Red River, suddenly Charlotte is sort of sent off on her way. And she's dismissed in a way that she finds extremely hurtful, but it's a catalyzing event for her because that's when she hardens inside and that's where she changes. And that's kind of like when she grows up and realizes that all of that stuff was a fantasy. Clément was a fantasy, everything was a fantasy. And then she has to like turn hard in a way.
So I think you can get an idea of how well Cheryl has developed 4 different characters who all lived in that particular time. So we get a good idea of the time and what was going on then, but we also have 4 well fleshed out characters, which makes it a really good novel. So any questions? Anybody want to ask questions about it?
You can always count on Kat.
So you mentioned, and this is an accurate statement by you, that a lot of the times the history of the Red River Métis is not covered in the books. You basically have to comb or chase down a sentence here or a paragraph there. So maybe this is a softball question, but I think it's an important one. As you were going through this process, what were your feelings like as you started to realize how hard it was to find this part of the narrative?
Yeah, a jumble of feelings. Like frustration, of course, because I wasn't finding what I wanted easily. But then also pride. Once I started, the more I read, the more I discovered, the more I amassed, and then the more I realized that like, I'm actually connected to these people. Like, as our great uncle was on that provisional government, and he's in that photo, that famous photo of all of them. Like I felt kind of lit up inside, actually. So I was cheesed off that I didn't get to learn any of this in school, and that the stuff I did learn in school kind of just certainly had a point of view that really wasn't very favorable to Métis people. And I didn't really embrace my Métis side because I sort of felt like, oh, that's something to be ashamed of, you know, like, or just keep that quiet, like, you know, be careful who you tell, don't tell anybody that. And then as I discovered all this, and I really embraced that culture, and I got my citizenship, and I, you know, went to all these events, and I started to feel like this is a community that I'm actually a part of, and it's okay, and it's actually, you can be proud of this. And so, yeah, it was a mixture of feelings, but in the end, I feel good about it. But I think there should be more. I want more books like this. I want to see like mini series. Where's the Netflix series about this? Like, yeah.
Well, I'm gonna ask. I'd like to know, my son has told me that your father read the book,
Yes.
and what was his reaction?
Okay. My mom called me on the weekend and told me that she read the book, that she loved it. And then she also said that my dad also read the book. And like my whole life, I've never seen my dad read a book, like ever, like a whole book, like no. So I pretty much like fell off my chair when I read that, but then he said he loved it too. So I was really, really blown away and touched by that, because I thought, wow, okay, I did something good.
What was your inspiration to actually start the book and then followed by the research?
Well, I've had the opening image of the story is a little boy playing in the tall grass, and he sees like a dust cloud coming towards him, and that's a man on a horse. And I've had that image in my head for years and years and years and years. And I didn't know what it was, but I knew it was gonna be something. So I just sort of filed it away. And then once I really started diving into my culture and learning about it, it started to take shape. And that's when I realized, like, I wanted to do something that tells this story, again, from the point of view of just normal people. And I knew that little boy was gonna be in the opening, and I knew he was gonna be in the opening, and he was gonna be the closing scene. So I knew I had those two bookends, and then I just had to fill in the rest.
Yeah, I didn't mention him. I was gonna say that he's at the beginning and also at the end. He's the youngest boy in the family. And so you get that feeling that life is gonna go on. You have a 5-year-old?
He's about 8.
By 8 by the end of it, yeah. And so it's sort of a nice idea to have the youngest kid at the beginning and at the end carrying the life on for the family. Any other questions?
Hi, Cheryl.
Hi.
Of the characters that you've written, which one did you identify most with? And which was the hardest to sort of flesh out in the story?
Okay, the hardest was the father, because he's sort of wants to keep the status quo, wants to sort of put his head in the sand and just not deal with things. And that's not really my way, so I found it hardest to connect with him. So I hope he does feel three-dimensional, because I tried. And at first, the easiest person was Charlotte. I've been a teenage girl myself. I have wanted finer things myself. So I found her easiest to get into, but then as I worked on, I found, so I put most of myself into Charlotte, I would say. But then as I kept going, I found I was finding pieces of myself in Marienne, the mother, and also in Mare, the grandmother. So I had this whole maiden mother crone thing happening where I've sort of seeing all the different aspects of maybe one person.
Hey, Cheryl.
Hey.
It's Michelle. I'm Cheryl's cousin, and it's really interesting to hear the story of kind of in familiar family told in that way and we would get together. So I really appreciated that, and I really appreciated how you told the story of the women. Because I know in our family, right?
Yeah,
Our grandma and family was, you know, everything, the bedrock.
yeah.
And then also just the fact that you're telling the story, and storytelling was a big piece of what we do. So thank you for carrying that on. Just wanted to say that.
Oh, thank you.
Hi.
Hi.
I actually have two-part question. So first would be, how hard or easy was it to write from a historical perspective? And then secondary to that, what's the sequel gonna be? Is it gonna be historical, maybe postscript, longer date?
Oh, thanks. Yeah, going back into in the past, you've got to be so careful about even just your turns of phrase. You know, like I couldn't say like they zipped along because like zippers weren't invented yet, right? So like even things like that, you had to make sure that you were really conscious of the time that you're in. I live really close to the St. Boniface Museum, so whenever I felt like I needed inspiration or something like that, I could just walk down the block and just walk and look at the artifacts and just, something could just spark the imagination or just ground me back in that time again. And sometimes I would find like the Red River Jig and listen to that to get me back into that space. And then if a sequel happens, well, I feel like these people, like you could tell their stories all the way through. You could tell, I don't know, maybe Charlotte has children and you tell her children's stories and her children's stories. Like our family is huge, and I think a lot of families are that way, where there's like cousins on top of cousins. They're all kind of connected in a way, and they're all interesting. And I think you could tell all of their stories in a way. So if people like this one, maybe I'll do another one.
Yeah, I think the thing about this book is that you feel good. Like you don't feel it's any great hardship to go back to the 19th century. In some books, this is a historical book, so oh God, who cares about that? But you have a good feeling right away, and think, when did this happen? Oh, and then you realize it does have the historical connections, but they don't get in the way. Everything just flows. Any other questions?
Do you have time for one more question if anyone has anything pressing?
Hi, Cheryl. Hi. I would like to know, when did you start the process of writing this book, and how long did it take?
Yeah, I started doing research, I think, in the summer of 21. And then, so it took me about a couple of years to get it done. I had my first draft done in sort of January of this year. And then it went back and forth through editing. So yeah, I was on contract, so I had a deadline. So, which is actually really good for me. I'm used to working the deadline. So it was like, I don't know if I could do it any other way, so. Yeah.
I'll now defer to Dave and Cheryl if they have any closing comments they might like to make.
Just want to say thanks to everyone for coming. This was really great. I hope you enjoy the book, and yeah, thank you.
Thank you for writing it, Cheryl.
And thank you for hosting this event, Dave. So thank you all for your attention this evening and for coming out. We will move along to the signing portion of the evening. So in just a moment, there'll be one bit of beautiful chaos while everybody tries to line up down this little corridor here. And then we'll have Cheryl at this table signing books. Please feel free to get a book signed before you pay for it. Just please do remember to pay for the book at some point. We're so grateful to Tidewater Press, to Dave Williamson for hosting, to all of you for joining us both physically here and online. Please give an incredibly warm round of applause to Cheryl.